She was 13 years old, barefoot, and already 3 miles into the dark when the first shot echoed off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. She did not stop. Settle in wherever you are tonight. Pour yourself something warm, pull a blanket close. Before we go any further, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing who's with us for these stories. Now, her name was Paloma Vasquez, and this is the night the San Luis Valley remembered for 100 years. The village of Cielo Bajo sat at the edge of the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1874. It was not large enough to appear on most military maps and not important enough for the land agents in Denver to bother naming correctly. 31 families lived there, Hispanic settlers whose grandfathers had farmed the same alluvial flats under Spanish land grants. Long before the territory changed hands, long before the flags changed, long before men like Captain Aldous Crane decided that paperwork filed in Washington could unmake 3 generations of labor overnight. The valley itself was enormous and flat and ringed on the east by the Sangre de Cristos, whose peaks turned blood red at sundown in a way that made the settlers' grandmothers say God was reminding them he was watching. The farms were modest. The acequia irrigation ditches ran clean and cold from the mountain snowmelt. The corn was good that year. The childs were better. Paloma Vasquez was the youngest daughter of Esperanza and Tomas Vasquez, who ran the largest farm in Cielo Bajo, not because they were rich, but because Tomas had spent 30 years dragging rocks out of the soil by hand. She was small for 13. She had her mother's dark braid and her father's habit of silence. The other girls her age gathered at the well and talked about boys from the neighboring villages. Paloma usually had somewhere else to be. She was good with numbers. The village schoolteacher, an elderly man named Senor Apodaca who had taught in Santa Fe before his eyes failed him, said she was the sharpest mind he had encountered in 40 years of instruction. She could calculate in her head what it took the land agents 3 days and a ledger book to work out. She noticed things. The way the creek rose 3 days before rain. The way the horses at the north pasture fence always faced south when something was coming from the mountains. The way Captain Crane's interpreter, a thin man named Sills, always looked at the ground when he translated, which meant he was changing the words. She had told her father about Sills 6 weeks ago. Tomas had listened carefully, the way he always listened to Paloma, and then said nothing, because there was nothing safe to do with the information yet. But Paloma had kept watching. That was why she was awake on the night of October 14th, 1874, when she should have been asleep. She had been lying on her mat listening to her parents' low voices through the wall, and when her father's voice dropped to the particular pitch it held when he was afraid, she had risen and gone to the window. The rider came from the north. Not the trail. The open grass. Moving fast and without a lantern. Paloma recognized him before he reached the fence. It was old Reyes, from the farm 3 miles up the valley, who had a bad knee and never rode at night. She was out the window before he reached the gate. Reyes was half off his horse when she caught the bridle. His face was gray. There was blood on his collar. "They are coming," he said. "Crane's men. The whole company. They have the eviction papers, and they have torches." He gripped her wrist. His hand was shaking. 40 riders. 40. They come from the Fort Garland Road. They plan to reach Cielo Bajo before dawn, before any man can organize. Paloma looked at his knee, swollen and wrapped in a cloth where he'd clearly fallen from the saddle once already. His horse was lathered and stumbling. "How far behind you?" "An hour. Maybe less." She looked at her house. Her father was already at the door, lamp in hand. She looked at the valley behind Reyes, black and flat and silent, the Sangre de Cristos a dark wall against the stars. Then she made a calculation that Senor Apodaca would have been proud of. 40 riders on a military road moved at roughly 8 miles per hour at a trot. Cielo Bajo to the high trail cutoff at Mesilla Creek was 4 miles by road. But she knew a way that was 2.5 miles, through the arroyo and across the upper pastures, that no cavalry horse could navigate in the dark. Legs could. "Papa," she said, "get everyone into the church. Bar the doors. Send Reyes to the Lucero farm for Senor Dominguez. He speaks English, and he has the original land grant copies. The ones from 1841. She was already untying her sandals, kicking them off. "I'm going for the settlement at Mesilla Creek. They have 40 men there, and 2 of them used to ride with the territorial volunteers." Her father took 1 step off the porch. "Paloma." "1 hour, Papa." Less. She was already moving. He said her name once more, into the dark. She did not answer. The arroyo at the back of the Vasquez property was a dry channel in summer, but in October it ran ankle-deep with cold mountain water and smelled of clay and sage. Paloma dropped into it at a run. The rocks were slick and her feet found them anyway, because she had been walking this arroyo since she was 4 years old, and her feet knew every stone the way her hands knew her own face. She ran, not the desperate, stumbling run of fear, the long, ground-eating stride she had developed over years of carrying irrigation water between the upper and lower fields when her father's back would not allow it. Her breathing settled. Her arms swung low. She had heard the women at the well laugh about her once. Too big in the shoulders for a girl, too long in the leg, built like a ranch hand rather than a daughter. She had carried that comment the way a stone sits in a boot, dully, constantly. She was carrying it now. It moved her faster. The arroyo bent east, and she bent with it, climbing the low bank where it shallowed near the old cottonwood grove. The cottonwoods were silver in the starlight. An owl moved in the branches without a sound. She ran through the grove, up the rise behind it, and onto the open pasture. Here the ground was flat and the grass was knee-high, and the Sangre de Cristos loomed ahead of her, enormous and indifferent, their lower slopes dark with juniper and pinyon. The air tasted of frost and pine resin. Her lungs burned pleasantly. She had 2 miles left. She gauged the stars. She had perhaps 45 minutes. She pushed harder. She was crossing the second pasture when she heard the hoofbeats. She flattened herself in the grass without thinking, on instinct the way a rabbit goes flat when the hawk turns. The hoofbeats were south of her, on the main road, maybe half a mile. She lifted her head just above the grass line. A column of cavalry, lantern dark, moving in disciplined silence. They were early. She counted the shapes against the road. Counted again. Not 40. More. She could see the rear torches now. They had been saving them. The torches were not for light. The torches were for burning. Her stomach dropped completely. She rose and ran. What would you have done in that moment? Flat in the grass, the cavalry between you and everything you had ever known, and the settlement still a mile ahead? Would you have risen? We wonder that sometimes. We genuinely do. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done in her place? She ran without any attempt at silence now. Speed was the only thing that mattered. She could feel the grass cutting her feet, and she let it cut, because that sensation told her she was still moving, still alive, still closing the distance. The pinyon slope began, and she went up it like water running uphill, which should have been impossible and wasn't. She heard a shout behind her on the road. She didn't look back. The trees swallowed her. The slope through the pinyon and juniper was steep enough that her hands went to the ground twice, catching herself on sharp rock. She tasted blood from a split lip where a branch had caught her in the dark. She registered these things the way you register weather, present, real, irrelevant to the direction of movement. Then the trees broke and the lights of Mesilla Creek settlement were below her. She went down the far slope at a pace that was closer to controlled falling than running, hit the flat ground, and ran for the largest building, the Montoya house, where she knew Aurelio Montoya kept his lamp burning late because he had trouble sleeping. She hit the door with both palms. Senor Montoya. Her voice came out ragged. She had not noticed her lungs until this moment. Senor Montoya. Cavalry. Crane's men. They are on the Cielo Bajo road right now. Tonight, with torches. 40 riders, maybe more. The door opened. Aurelio Montoya was 62 years old, with a white beard and the deliberate movements of a man who had stopped hurrying decades ago and never missed it. He looked at the girl on his porch, bleeding, barefoot, chest heaving, and said nothing for 2 full seconds. Then, how far? They were on the south road when I crossed the upper pasture. That was, she calculated, 12 minutes ago at my pace. They moved slower on the road. He nodded once. Then he turned back into the house, and she heard his voice change entirely, dropping into the flat command register of a man who had once held a sergeant's rank with the 1st Colorado Cavalry Volunteers. Fuera. Todos. Ahora mismo. The settlement woke. She stood on the porch, hands on her knees, and let herself breathe for 30 seconds, which was all she could afford. Inside, she heard Montoya speaking with another man, his voice low and precise. The other man she recognized as Crispin Herrera, who was 40 and had a bad reputation among the Anglo settlers in Alamosa because he knew exactly what the land grant document said and was not shy about saying it in English in front of judges. He came out of the house with a leather satchel she guessed contained papers. "Your village's documents," she said. "My father is getting them now. The 1841 grants." Herrera looked at her. Really looked at her. She was used to adults looking past her. He did not. "Those documents were contested in the Denver filing 2 months ago," he said carefully. "Crane has a counterfiling. Under territorial law, if the counterfiling was received before your village responded." "We responded," Paloma said. "I wrote the response myself. In English. Senor Apodaca's hand is too unsteady now for legal correspondence. My father signed it. But Sills, Crane's interpreter, I don't think he filed it. I think he held it." Herrera was very still. "You have proof of this?" "I have the copy we kept. And I have the date." "That is enough," he said. "If we reach your village before Crane's men destroy anything." She pushed off the porch rail. "Then we had better run." They came off the mountain in a column of 38 men, Montoya's settlement, the Dominguez cousins who'd arrived from the Lucero farm, and 2 former territorial volunteers who rode with old cavalry rifles and expressions that suggested they had been waiting a long time for someone to give them a legitimate reason to use them. Paloma ran at the front of the column because she knew the fastest way down, and none of the men argued. The first torchlight from Crane's column was visible over the lower ridge when they hit the valley floor. Cielo Bajo's church bell was ringing. Her father's signal that the families were gathered and barricaded. The sound of it moved through her chest like a hand placed there in reassurance. Crane's column came down the main road in a double file, confident in the way that men with authority and numbers are confident, which is to say not confident at all, but dressed very convincingly in the appearance of it. Captain Aldous Crane rode at the head on a gray horse. He was a large man, carefully built, with the kind of face that photographs well and means very little. He had filed 37 eviction actions in the San Luis Valley in the preceding 14 months and had a clerk in Denver who ensured the paperwork always arrived before the settlers could respond, or appeared to. He drew up at the edge of the village square when he saw the lights, when he saw the number of men, when he saw the 2 former volunteers, whose faces he apparently recognized, because his horse shifted under him and he steadied it too quickly. "This is a lawful eviction proceeding," he called out. The confidence in his voice was professional and almost real. "These properties have been ceded under counterfiling." The counterfiling was fraudulent. Crispin Herrera stepped forward with his satchel open. His English was as clean and precise as a courtroom, which is where he had learned it. "We have the original response document, dated and signed, which was never filed by your interpreter, a man named Sills, who you employed specifically to intercept legal correspondence from Hispanic settlers across this valley. I have 3 other unfiled responses in this satchel. I have a wire already sent to Judge Hallett in Denver, the same Judge Hallett who ruled against unlawful seizure in the Taos case of 1872. He paused, and the pause was a specific, deliberate wait. "The wire went out from the Alamosa Telegraph Office 4 hours ago, Captain, when we first received word you were moving tonight. Which tells me one thing." Crane said nothing. "It tells me you knew the filing was fraudulent. Because a man executing a legal eviction does not ride at night without lanterns." The silence was the kind that happens when a room discovers the ceiling is lower than it looked. Captain Crane looked at the men arranged in the firelight. He looked at the former volunteers. He looked at the women standing in the church doorway, having refused to stay inside once they heard the column stop. He looked at Paloma Vasquez, standing in the middle of all of it, 13 years old, bleeding from 3 cuts, barefoot in October, and looking back at him with no expression he could name. He turned his horse. "Mount up," he said quietly, to his column. Nobody moved for 2 seconds. 3. Then they moved. If this story has moved you tonight, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. We write these for you. We mean that. The fire they didn't build. The homes they didn't burn. The families who came out of the church into the cold night air and stood together in the square and didn't speak for a long time, because some things are too large for immediate language. Paloma's mother found her at the edge of the square and said nothing, just pulled her close. Her father stood a few steps away with his hand pressed flat against the wall of the church, the way a man touches something solid to confirm it is still real. Montoya came and stood beside Tomas, and the two men looked at each other with the particular communication of men who have been through something and have no appropriate words and know it. Crispin Herrera was already drafting a formal complaint by lamplight, his pen moving in a quick, efficient scratch. He had witnesses. He had dates. He had the 3 other unfiled responses from other settlements. He told Tomas quietly, enough to bring a federal case that would reach beyond Crane and back to the Denver land office where the fraud had originated. It took for months. It was not clean, the way justice rarely is. There were depositions and delays, and a territorial judge who required the evidence repeated twice before he would commit his signature to it. There was a week in February when it looked as though the case might collapse around a procedural objection that Herrera called the most cynical use of paper he had ever witnessed. But Hallett's court ruled in March. The counterfilings, all 37 of them across the valley, were vacated. Sills was charged with fraud and interference with legal correspondence, and the Colorado Territorial Penitentiary in Cannon City, which had opened its doors in 1871, received him as a guest shortly afterward. Captain Aldous Crane was stripped of his commission and his land-grant licenses and was last reported seen in Kansas, where people did not yet know his face. The 37 families kept their land. Paloma sat in the Montoya parlor in Mesilla Creek on the evening the ruling came in, listening to Herrera read it aloud in both English and Spanish, and felt something inside her chest release that she had not known was held. The word for it was not happiness exactly. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a stone you've been carrying so long you forgot you were carrying it. Montoya's wife pressed a cup of coffee into her hands, hot and bitter and good, and sat beside her. "You know," the old woman said, almost to herself, "the things we believe are too heavy to carry. They turn out to be the only things that ever got us anywhere." Paloma held the coffee cup in both hands and didn't answer. There was nothing to add to that. Senor Apodaca retired the following spring and recommended Paloma specifically to the new schoolteacher coming from Santa Fe, not as a student, but as an assistant. She was 14 by then. She corrected the new teacher's arithmetic in the first week, politely, in front of the class. He took it better than expected and promoted her to full teaching duties for the upper students by October. She taught in Cielo Bajo for 11 years. She documented the land grant history of the San Luis Valley in a ledger that Crispin Herrera later cited in 3 separate territorial cases. She married at 25, a quiet man from Taos named Gabriel who had a gift for carpentry and the good sense to know he had married up significantly. He told her so on a regular basis, which she found acceptable. Her father's farm passed to her on Tomas's death in 1891. She planted the same corn and the same chiles. She ran the same acequias her grandfather had dug. On a morning in October, decades later, with the Sangre de Cristos burning their usual impossible red above the valley, a young girl about 13 years old came running across the lower pasture at that particular ground-eating stride that had nothing in it of urgency and everything in it of purpose. Paloma, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she watched the mountains, recognized the stride the way you recognize music you heard as a child. The girl was her granddaughter. She had her great-great-grandfather's shoulders and her grandmother's eyes and a mind for numbers that her school teacher in Alamosa had apparently mentioned to the parents 3 times already. She ran with her arms swinging low and her feet reading the ground. Paloma watched her come and did not call her name. Some things are worth watching without interruption. She supposed the valley was in good hands. Next time, we'll tell the story of a widow in the Montana Territory who discovered her late husband had a second family, and the letter from that family's daughter that arrived on the same day as the bank's foreclosure notice, written in the same handwriting as the man they both thought they'd known. 2 women, 1 impossible inheritance, and a choice neither of them should have had to make alone. We'll see you then. Thank you for being here.